talk to you about the world's greatest living adventurer. And you were given some homework to try and work out who that was, and there's a prize pack donated by the ship for the person who can get it first. This is a backpack and water bottle and a few other things, so have a think about it. You've got a couple more minutes to think about it while I do a brief introduction for the people who weren't here on day one. So my name's Jeff Peters, and until recently my lovely wife Leanne and I lived on the beautiful Sunshine Coast in Queensland, Australia. Beginning of last year we retired. We bought this boat over in England and with plans to cruise the rivers, canals and coastlines of Europe for the foreseeable future. And some people have asked us about the boat, so I'll just explain. It's a 40-foot fiberglass motor cruiser. With twin 300 horsepower engines, so it gets along at about 26 knots if we need it to. It's designed as a coastal cruiser, but one of the things we love about it is that it's very flexible. This radar arch here folds down, and the windows actually are on hinges and they fold down as well, which gives the boat a much lower profile or air draft. The distance from the water to the top of the boat, which means that we can get under all the bridges in Europe. So the plan was that we would use this as to cruise around the inland waterways of Europe, the rivers and canals. So we took it, we picked it up in Southampton in England at the end of May last year, and we spent a few weeks cruising the boat along the coast of England, along the English Channel, up to the Thames and into London, where we stayed for a month and had a wonderful time there, had some wonderful experiences. And then we took it across the English Channel, which Lee really enjoyed, and to Dunkirk in France. And from there, which is where the photo was taken incidentally, and from there we started cruising through the inland waterways, so the rivers and canals. So for those of you who don't know, most of the rivers in Europe are connected by man-made canals, most of them constructed back in Roman times. And a lot of the cities and towns are also connected by these canals. And you can cruise through them, and if you need to go up any elevation, you go through a series of locks, or if you have to come down, once again through a series of locks. So it's great fun. And we started off in Dunkirk, as I said, and started through northern France, and then into Belgium. And then when it got too cold at the beginning of October for a couple of sun-loving Aussies, we took the boat out of the water, put it on a hard stand, and we left to do other things. So we did some house sitting and pet sitting in the UK and Cyprus. And then back in March, we headed back to Australia to finish off some work I was doing with the Scottish Commonwealth Games team and to see family and friends. And then when we finish this cruise in Seattle, we'll fly back to Antwerp and pick up the boat and start cruising through Holland and recommence our adventures, which are nothing like the adventures of the person I'm going to speak about today. That was a nice segue, wasn't it? This is a person that I believe to be the world's greatest living adventurer. But it's not just me that believes that. So Richard Branson has said that this man, and there's a hint for you, that takes out 3.25 billion people, this man has no peer when it comes to adventurers today. So has anybody got any ideas who this might be? Call it out. Sorry, one. Fines? Okay. Okay. Has anybody ever heard of a 60... Sorry? He's not living, is he? Has anybody ever heard of a 67-year-old Russian Orthodox priest by the name of Fedor Konyukhov? Well, that's good, because it means everyone's going to learn something today. And I was also blissfully unaware of Fedor Konyukhov until about 4 years ago. It was late in May 2014. At the time, I was working for Sunshine Coast Regional Council, which, for our American friends, is a bit like a county, and about an hour north of Brisbane, the state capital of Queensland. And my job in the council was to build the economy through tourism and sport. We had other people who were building the economy through aviation and agriculture and things like that, but my job was tourism and sport. And great job, really enjoyed doing it. And one Monday morning, I went to work as usual, and I did a few things in the morning, and around about mid-morning, I went and made myself a cup of coffee and went back to my desk and started thrumming through the local newspaper. And on page 4, there was a story about this Russian Orthodox priest who was trying to be the first person to successfully row across the Pacific, where we are now. He was rowing from South America to Australia. And if he was successful, it would be the longest solo man-powered voyage in the history of the world. And it went on to say that he was going to be arriving on the Sunshine Coast later that week. And I thought, what? How come we don't know about this? It was the first I'd ever heard of it. And just then the phone rang, and it was the CEO of council, who is several rungs on the food chain above me. And he said, have you read this story about the Russian rower? And I said, yes, I have. I'm just reading it now. And he said, okay, well, I want you to handle it. And I said, handle it. And he said, yeah, just do what it is that you do. And at the time, I had a reputation within council of having the best network of business contacts of anyone in council. And I also had the reputation that I could see an opportunity or develop an opportunity or create an opportunity and then leverage it to the maximum amount and wring everything out of it, all the potential out of it, and try and make it bigger than it was ever going to be. And that's what he wanted me to do. So I thought, well, that's great. This is a really good little project. This is going to be a lot of fun. So the first thing I did was rang the journalist and said to him, where did you get this from? I've never heard of this guy. Where did you get this? And he said that Fedor's son, Oscar Konyukhov, was on the Sunshine Coast to support his father's arrival, and that Oscar had rung the newspaper a few days before, and they'd sat down and talked about it, and that's how the story was written. And he said that Oscar spoke very good English, and he was on the coast, as I said, and he was looking for support. And the journalist actually said to me, I was actually going to give you a call because he does need help, and I thought you'd be the best person to help him. So I got Oscar's phone number and contact details. He was staying down at Mooloolaba, which is our main beach, and I gave him a call, and he was very happy to hear from me. We have 3 levels of government in Australia: federal, state and local, which is at least one too many in my opinion. And he didn't know who to ring within what department of what level of government. So he was happy to hear from someone who was willing to give him a hand. So I found out, as I said, he was staying at Mooloolaba, and I said to him, do you know where the yacht club is? And he said, but of course, and which is a thing that I found out Russians say quite a bit. And I said, okay, well, how about I meet you at the yacht club in about half an hour? So I did a few things, tidied a few things up, and got in the car and went down to the yacht club to meet Oscar Konyukhov. Now, really nice guy, speaks English very well. His father doesn't speak a word of English, which is a bit of an issue. But Oscar Konyukhov, it turns out, looks exactly like the Hollywood star of Scottish descent, Gerard Butler. And this was pointed out to be by none other than Terry Irwin from Australia Zoo. Now, Terry and I have worked on a lot of projects together over the years, have a lot of respect for her. She's a great businesswoman, great mother, very passionate about her family and about conservation. And I have to tell the story, I have to fast forward 12 months from the first meeting with Oscar, so in May 2014 to May 2015. And I'd been telling Terry about, and Oscar and Fedor and Oscar's family were back on the Sunshine Coast to unveil a commemorative plaque to celebrate his voyage. And I've been telling Terry about him, and she asked if I could set up a meeting. So, because Fedor is very much into conservation himself. He does a lot of work about the conservation of the Siberian tiger and also about cleaning out the Pacific. And so she asked if I could set up a meeting, and I said yes. And so the meeting was actually once again at the yacht club at Mooloolaba. And I was out there with Fedor and Oscar and Oscar's family on the back deck of the yacht club overlooking a beautiful marina. And I looked up and could see Terry striding through the foyer of the yacht club. And she had Bindi with her. And whenever Terry walks anywhere, it's with a lot of purpose. And so she came through, and as she came out the back, she suddenly stopped and looked at Oscar, threw out her arms and said, "What are you doing here?" And she went and hugged Oscar. And I'm standing there going, okay, what's going on here? And by the look on Oscar's face, he was thinking, what's going on here? And the look on Oscar's wife's face, it was, what the hell is going on here? And Terry had met Jerry Butler in Hollywood several months before, and she was convinced that this was Jerry Butler. And she didn't understand why he was speaking to her with a Russian accent rather than a Scottish accent. And she immediately thought that this was a setup and she was a victim of a hidden camera show. And now Terry she'd be the first to admit, she hasn't got the greatest sense of humour in the world, and she wasn't happy. And because I'd set up the meeting, she wasn't happy with me, and that's not really a place you want to be. And so there was a couple of minutes of confusion where we tried to sort things out. She pulled out her phone and went through and showed us a picture of her with Jerry Butler. And these photos don't do justice. I mean, Oscar looks exactly like Gerard Butler. And in the end, I asked Bindi to pull out her phone and Google Oscar Konyukhov. And it was only then that Terry started settling down, and we were able to have a really good, positive meeting. And they did decide everyone got on very well, and they did decide to work on conservation projects together. But even as Terry and Bindi and I were walking out the yacht club that afternoon, we were having a bit of a joke about what had happened, and Terry admitted that she was still looking around for hidden cameras. So it was quite a bit of fun. So we had going back to the first meeting with Oscar, he was after a bit of help. He said, is it possible to have a boat, a large boat that could guide my father into Mooloolaba? So I said, okay, then no problem. I know the Commodore of the Coast Guard. I'm sure he'd be willing to help. And he also said that if anyone touches the boat before it actually lands, it would put the whole record attempt in jeopardy because it's a solo, unassisted thing. So if someone actually touched the boat, it might put everything in jeopardy. So I said, okay, we'll get the local surf clubs to use their inflatable rescue boats and form a perimeter around the boat so no one can get in there. And there was a couple other things as well, but we sorted all those out. And then he said something that struck me. He said, because of the things that his father had done in the past, the adventures that his father had done in the past, he was considered a national hero in Russia. And it was the first time I thought that, even consider that this guy had done anything else. So I made a mental note that when I got back to the office, I'd have to look him up and see what other things he'd done. But Oscar said that because he was a hero in Russia, that there was a film crew from Russian television on the coast at the time to film his arrival. And that he'd invited the producer who was travelling with the film crew to come down to the meeting we were at. And he also said that on Thursday, that the Russian ambassador to Australia was flying in. He was going to stay as long as it took to greet Fedor, and that he was going to read a personal letter of congratulation from President Vladimir Putin. So I'm thinking, okay, well, Russian ambassador, we don't usually get ambassadors on official business to the Sunshine Coast. It's not that sort of place, especially ambassadors from a big country like Russia. So perhaps this is going to be a little bit more a bigger project than I thought it was going to be. Obviously going to become political now. So that was okay. But I still had one question for Oscar. But before I could ask him that, the producer of the TV crew came down, and lovely young lady, and she started talking about what they were doing and what equipment she needed. She was after a contact with one of the local television stations so they could do some editing. So I said that we could arrange that. And I said to her, is it all you're doing filming his arrival, or would you like to do some other filming while you're here on the coast? And she said, but of course, but I don't know what to do. So I rang Australia Zoo and organised for them to go out there that afternoon and do the usual thing where the reporter cuddle a koala and fed a kangaroo and fed a crocodile. And then the next day, we threw the reporter into the shark tank at Sea Life Aquarium, and it made for really good television because he was absolutely petrified. He thought he was going to die. He was trembling with terror. I thought we were going to have to go and buy an adult nappy for him, and I didn't really know how that was going to work in a wetsuit. And then the next day, we did, one of the surf clubs did a mock surf carnival, and he was taken out to sea in an inflatable rescue boat and dumped there, and a big burly lifesaver paddled out on a rescue board, and they put him on the board, and as they were coming back they surfed down and waved together. Made for great film. And then when he got to the beach, this gorgeous lifesaver in a bikini gave him mouth to mouth. So his experience was better that day than the day before, and he was a lot happier. But each night they would go back to the local TV station and edit the footage and then beam it up to Moscow. And so every morning on their version of Good Morning Russia, this film of the Sunshine Coast was going out to tens of millions of Russians who were just waiting for information about their national hero. So it was great. But as I said, I had a question for Oscar that I didn't understand. I mean, the Sunshine Coast is a beautiful place. This is Mooloolaba Beach, one of our main beaches, and this is the Glasshouse Mountains near where Australia Zoo is, and there's some wonderful Dreamtime stories and Aboriginal legends about these mountains. And we've got lovely hinterland, rainforests, etc. But if I was going to be the first person to row across the Pacific Ocean, I'd be rowing straight into Sydney Harbour and pulling up on the steps of the Opera House to make a really big deal of it. Or I'd be rowing into Byron Bay, which is the easternmost part of Australia, and saving myself some rowing. So why the Sunshine Coast? And he said there's a couple of reasons. And number one, the currents were perfect for the Sunshine Coast. And for those, there were some people here the other day, or at the other venue the other day, I spoke about the Kontiki expedition and how about in the 1970s there was a raft built called La Bolsa, and they sailed from South America to Mooloolaba. They drifted. They couldn't steer the raft at all. They just drifted across the Pacific Ocean, and after 161 days they landed at Mooloolaba, which 161 days, coincidentally, is the time that Fedor took. And so the tides were perfect, the currents were perfect, but he said the real reason was that the boat had been built in England, and it was state-of-the-art carbon fibre boat with all the mod cons like satellite communication and GPS and everything. And part of the deal with the boat builder was that if Fedor actually made it across, then the boat would be sent back to England so the boat builder could use it to promote his business and his expertise. And the boat builder had a brother who lived on the Sunshine Coast. And he asked his brother, if this Russian actually makes it, can you help with the logistics of sending the boat back to me in England? And the brother said, happy to, but it'd be easier for me if he actually arrived here. And so they got together, everyone got together and had a look at the charts and things, and that's how they decided to go to the Sunshine Coast. So sliding doors. I mean, if that hadn't happened, he wouldn't have arrived there. I wouldn't be here talking to you about it today. But this is actually the beach that he arrived on, so it's not a bad place to be. It's actually, we get cruise ships into this bay now, which is great for the region. So Oscar and I agreed to keep in contact, and I went back to the office and I decided to look up, who is this guy? And it turns out, Google is your friend, And I Googled him, and it turns out that he was born in the Ukraine in 1950. His father was a fisherman, and he spent a lot of time at sea as a child. When he was 18, he was conscripted into the Soviet Navy, and after his initial training, he was selected for Special Forces training. And for 2.5 years, his main role was to smuggle munitions from the Soviet Union into North Vietnam to help the cause of the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong. But when he was discharged from the Navy, he was so disillusioned by what he had seen and done, he decided to go to the opposite end spectrum. He enrolled in art school and decided he was going to become an artist. But in 1983, he saw an ad for looking for volunteers for an expedition to raft down the Lena River in Siberia, and he applied for it. Initially, he was rejected, and it wasn't until the last minute when someone else pulled out that he was called upon to go on this expedition. Now, I haven't been to Siberia, but I've been told that it can get a bit chilly there. So 3 months on an open raft going down this river. And the whole idea of it was to research the river itself, what was there, who the people were that were living there, because it was so remote. So he was involved in that for 3 months, and he did such a good job that 2 years later he was selected for another expedition to study the Siberian tiger population. Now this was another expedition that was involved rafting and also canoeing, and a lot of the work was also done on horseback. And since that time he's had a passion about conservation of the Siberian tiger, which is an endangered species. In 1988, he was part of the Russian-Canadian team that was going to ski to the North Pole. So that was the first time he went to the North Pole. And then in 1989, he did another trek, walking to the North Pole unassisted. The next year, he was leader of a Russian-American bicycle crossing. Now, Russia's the largest country in the world, and this bicycle crossing was from one side of Russia to the other with a group of Americans, and this was supposed to be to promote friendship and understanding between the two countries, which is a noble gesture. I just don't know how friendly I would be after 131 days on a bicycle seat. In 1990, he did his first solo ski to the North Pole. And then on the same year, he was the first Russian to complete a solo, unassisted circumnavigation of the world in a yacht. In 1992, he summited Mount Everest for the first time. In 1995-96, he did a solo, unsupported trek to the South Pole. And while he was there, he climbed the highest peak in Antarctica. So by 1997, he had achieved the 7 Summits Challenge, which was to climb the highest peak on each of the 7 continents. In 2000, he competed in the Iditarod race in Alaska, so 1,150 miles, as a dog sled race, and he actually won his category that year of novice racer. And in 2002, he rode solo across the Atlantic, setting a new world record. Now, that's rowing and dog sledding and skiing and mountain climbing and rafting and yachting, etc., etc. But I know you guys are a bit of a tough audience, and you can see there that there's some gaps in there. So what was he doing with the rest of his time? Well, by 2005, he'd complete his 4th solo navigation of the world in a yacht. But wait, there's more. In 2011, he crossed the Danakil Desert in Ethiopia on a camel, the first person to do so, the first person silly enough to even try. I should have also mentioned that by 2010, he'd done all the study and the exams, and he was ordained as a Russian Orthodox Priest. In 2012, he summited Mount Everest for the 2nd time. And then he set a new world record for the circumnavigation of Antarctica, and I'll go through that a little bit more later on. He is the third person to achieve the Explorer's Grand Slam, which is to summit the highest peaks on the seven continents, and to walk to the North Pole and walk to the South Pole. He is the only person on the planet of 6.5 billion people to have achieved the 5 extreme poles on Earth, which are the North Pole, which he's now done 4 times, the South Pole, the pole of inaccessibility. Now that's a geographical location in the Arctic, which is considered to be the most difficult place to get to anywhere in the world. It's the point that's furthest away from any form of support, and probably the most difficult thing he's ever done. He's also been to the top of Mount Everest twice, which is considered to be the mountaineer's pole, and he's gone around Cape Horn 4 times, which is considered to be the yachtsman's extreme pole. And these are some photos from some of those adventures. So pretty impressive sort of resume. And he was coming to the coast. He's also an accomplished artist, and as I said, he went to art school, and he's got more than 3,000 paintings and sculptures on display in galleries around the world, mostly in Russia and the Ukraine. In '83, he was the youngest person ever admitted to the Union of Artists of the Soviet Union, and he's a gold medalist of the Russian Arts Academy. And most of his paintings and sculptures are to do with the expeditions that he's been on. And this was the route he was going to take on the voyage across the Pacific, going to start in Cancun in Chile, across the Pacific. And for those people who were here for the Kon-Tiki expedition the other day, you can see he took pretty much the same sort of route, because that's the main current that goes across the Pacific, the Humboldt Current. So when I left Oscar that day, that first day, on that Monday, it was going to be a case of that he was expecting his father to arrive on the Friday, but it was open to a lot of variances, you know, the weather, the tides, how his father was feeling, how much energy he had, etc., etc. And then on the Tuesday, Oscar phoned me and said, it's probably not going to be Friday, it's going to be Saturday. And then on the Wednesday he phoned and said, it's not going to be Saturday anymore, or it might be Saturday, but it's more likely to be Sunday. On the Thursday he phoned and said, it's probably going to be Monday, but it might still be Sunday, we're not really sure. The weather keeps changing all the time. And then on the Friday morning at 9 o'clock, I got a phone call from Oscar and said it's going to be tomorrow at 9 o'clock. So in 24 hours he's going to be here. And I'm, wow, okay, that was quick. And the plan was that he was going to come out from out at sea out here, around Point Cartwright here, and then into the beach over here, which is opposite the yacht club. And that was plan A. So there's a lot of preparations to get done. When Oscar phoned, he said that he and some of his family and supporters were having a barbecue that night, and asked whether Lee and I would like to come along, and it was great. It was such an honour to be invited along to this thing, and there was lots of excitement, lots of music and singing. It was pretty hard to understand what was going on most of the time, because only 2 people there spoke English, which was Oscar and the Russian ambassador, but. It was a great night nonetheless, and we really enjoyed ourselves. But it had to break up fairly early, because the next day he was going to be arriving. So that Saturday morning, before that happened, on the Friday evening, on Friday afternoon, our media people rang me and said, we've sent out press releases about what's happening, and there seems to be a lot of interest in what's going on. But tomorrow's Saturday, I'm not working, would you mind if I gave all the media your phone number and they can contact you? And I said, yeah, no problem, no problem. So I got down there the next morning at 6:30 and the phone went nuts. We had helicopters all through the sky. The media wanted to know the coordinates where he was, so we were able to get that and communicate that. We had lots of Russians from all over Australia and New Zealand, most of them in their national costume, and a lot of them carrying breads and cakes that were going to be an offering to their priest and their hero. And so it was a lot of atmosphere happening. And Oscar phoned, and he was out in what we call a tinny in Australia, which is a 4-metre aluminium open boat with an outboard on the back. And he was out near his father, and he had the Russian TV crew with him. And they were terribly, terribly seasick. They weren't doing much filming at all. It was the conditions had changed. It was bumpy out there again, and these poor guys were in an awful state. And Oscar said that it's not going to be, conditions have got bad again, it's not going to be 9 o'clock, it's more likely going to be 11 o'clock. So, okay. And then around about 10 o'clock he phoned and said, it's not going to be 11, it's probably going to be 1. And then he phoned and said, well, he's going to get here when he gets here, sort of thing. So, no problem, we'll just wait. So we were at the yacht club and it was pretty packed. And then just after lunch we had the first problem, the first glitch. And Oscar phoned and he said, Jeff, I've just been told that your immigration and customs people are going to charge $1,100 to inspect the boat. We haven't got that in the budget. Can you help? Now, customs and immigration are federal and I'm local, so I didn't really have any control over it all. But I said, I'll see what I could do. And then a minute later, the Russian ambassador storms across the yacht club and comes to me and says, Jeff, I've just been told that you're at customs and immigration. I said, yes, Mr. Ambassador, I know, I'm working on it, just chill. And Lee came up to me later and said, you told the Russian ambassador to chill. So, and the customs guy, immigration guy, was there in his uniform. So I went up to him and said, what's all this about? And he said, well, Mooloolaba isn't a designated arrival port, and this is a Saturday, so there's penalty rates that apply. So $800 of that $1,100 is for him coming up on a Saturday to do the paperwork. And he said, if I could waive it, I would, but I haven't got the authority to waive it. I said, okay. And I said, well, what exactly are you looking for? And he said, you know, the usual fresh fruit and vegetables. And I said, well, he's been at sea for 160 days. How fresh do you think they're going to be? And he said, I know, I have to go through the motions though. And I said to him, well, what happens if he doesn't pay? What are you going to do? And he said, well, as long as his passport's in order, he'll be able to come ashore, but we'll have to confiscate the boat and he won't be able to take anything off it. And I thought, oh my God, this has suddenly gone from a really good news story to a really bad news story. And you can imagine how the media would have played with this as a negative story. And I thought, well, you know, the next Russian tourist we get to the Sunshine Coast is going to be the 504th Parachute Regiment dropping in to come and get their boat back. So I tried making a few calls to some superiors to see what we could do, and because it was a Saturday, no one was picking up their phone. So in the end, I said, okay, well, council would pay the cost of this fee on the basis that we would try and have it waived. In the end, it was waived, and everything was fine. But in a second, I'll show you a video of his arrival, and you'll see Oscar holding up the passport with a big smile on his face, and that's what all this is about. Now, during that week as well, we did a lot of local publicity through radio and television, and the basis of that was about there's never ever going to be another first person to step foot on the moon. There's never going to be another first person to reach the South Pole. There's never ever going to be another first person to climb Everest. And there's never going to be another first person to row solo across the Pacific. So if you want to be part of history, you should be coming down. And it was great because a lot of people did come down, and Lee and I, in the afternoon, we jumped on a Coast Guard boat and went out to meet Fedor and guide him in. And there was people on the headlands around Point Cartwright here, and people on the breakwaters here and here. Hundreds and hundreds of people, all applauding and screaming. So it was really good fun. But I'll show you that video now of him arriving, hopefully. Okay. It doesn't. Oh, here we go. Fortunately, we haven't got any sound on this today. Now, during this crossing, he did more than 1.31 million double row oars, which equates to about 8. There's the passport with Oscar, which equates to about 8 strokes every minute for 14 hours every day. So a big effort. This is the first time he's set foot on land and been able to take a few steps in 5 months. And he was greeted by his grandchildren. And that's Oscar's wife. And so it was a really good moment. And as I said, 1.31 million double row oars. It had a counter on the oars, which is a great effort. I mean, we're here on a luxury cruise ship. We're not even halfway across the Pacific. We've got people serving us, preparing and serving us lovely meals every day. We've got entertainment, we've got drinks, and I'm exhausted at the end of each day. So good on him. So Lee and I went down and Oscar introduced us to Fedor, and then Oscar was going to take the boat back around to the yacht club. I'll just show you to the back of the yacht club. And at the time, Fedor was going to go off with and give a mass for the Russians that were there. So Lee and I walked back over to the yacht club, went out the back. We got a couple of drinks, a couple of glasses of wine, which, as you get to know us, you will find is our natural habitat. And we were sitting there. There was a room full of media to the side, and someone came out and said, "Are you going to start the press conference?" And I said, "Yeah, when he gets here." And they said, "He's here. He's sitting at the bar. He's been there for the last 10 minutes having a cup of tea." And I, "What?" And he'd finished giving the mass for the people who walked across the street into the side entrance of the yacht club, and gone up to the bar and indicated that he'd like a cup of tea. He doesn't speak English. So he was sitting there on his own after being at sea for 5 months, having a cup of tea. Just a very unassuming sort of man. So we went down, had a ceremony down on the water's edge with the boat in the background, and he was presented with a surfboard with a photo on it which indicated where he actually landed, with an inscription there about the journey itself. And then he turned around straight away and undid one of the oars from the boat and handed that to the acting mayor, because our mayor was overseas, and he presented that to the people of the Sunshine Coast. And then a few days later, our mayor came back and he said that he wanted to meet Fedor. So we went down once again to the yacht club. They make really good coffee there. And he autographed the oar and dated it and that's now on display at a council office in Mooloolaba. And while he was there, though, he was speaking to the mayor through Oscar, and he said, would it be possible to get a plaque placed near where he arrived? And the mayor said, I think that's a great idea. And he looked at me, which is international code for you organise it. So we did that. And then I had a friend design this plaque and plinth, and that's now on display on a walking track near where he actually arrived. And 12 months later, they came back. Oscar and Fedor came back and did the unveiling of the plaque. And it was another great day because once again we had lots of Russians there and in national costume, and once again they'd baked loaves of bread and cakes for their hero. The Great Moscow Circus was actually in town, coincidentally, and I went to see them the day before and spoke with the manager, and I said, have you ever heard of Fedor Konyukhov? And he said, but of course. And so I said, he's going to be here tomorrow. Would you like to, someone come down? And apparently that next matinee, that next day, the matinee was only done by non-Russians. All the Russians actually came down to see their national hero, and we had acrobats and jugglers and things, and it was a really good day. Now, I was talking before about his circumnavigation of Antarctica. Not many people know how big Antarctica is. This is the continent of Antarctica with the USA superimposed on it. So Antarctica is probably at least 50% bigger than the United States. And that's before you start adding in the ice that surrounds Antarctica as well. And he had set, as I said before, he had set the world record for circumnavigation of Antarctica. But we had a girl on the Sunshine Coast, and Australians might remember her, Jessica Watson, who in 2010, at the age of 16, became the youngest person to circumnavigate the world in a yacht. And she had inspired a whole stack of other people. And one of them was a young girl called Lisa Blair. And Lisa had contacted me about 18 months before all this had happened and said that she wanted to be the first person the first woman to circumnavigate Antarctica, and that there was this Russian guy who had the world record, and she wanted to try and break his world record. So when I was reading through Fedor's bio, I realised that this is the same guy. So I rang Lisa and said, is it Fedor Konyukhov's record that you're trying to break? And she said, yes. And I said, well, he's going to be here in the next few days. He's rowing across the Pacific, and so you should come up and talk to him. So she was in Sydney at the time, and she flew back to the coast and introduced her to Fedor, and he was absolutely fantastic. He and Oscar and Lisa went upstairs in one of the offices of the yacht club and spent hours and hours and hours going through information that she would need to try and break his record. And he was completely cooperative, really class act. And she was very, very grateful. And this time last year, she was in the middle of her attempt to sail around Antarctica. And she was going pretty well for a few weeks, and then she hit a massive storm hit her. And for 5 days, this storm battered her boat. She had to take in all the sails, secured everything as well as she possibly could. And then she just battened down the hatches, closed everything off, sealed everything, and had to just hang on. And for 5 days she was smashed, and on at least 2 occasions the boat actually breached, went right upside down, so the mast was pointing down and the keel was pointing up before it righted itself. So, I mean, she was days, if not weeks, away from any sort of rescue in some of the worst oceans of the world. And can you imagine how terrifying that would be for a young girl? So, but she continued on, and she kept on going, and she got around 2/3 of the way around, and she got hit by another storm. And this time it broke her mast, and so she had to finish the attempt, and she limped into Cape Town to try and to do repairs. But she's been the skipper of her own boat with an all-female crew in the last 3 Sydney to Hobarts and yacht races, and she's going to do another attempt of Antarctica fairly soon, which is great. But while Fedor and Oscar were back on the coast to unveil the plaque, we went out for dinner one night, and just jokingly I said, well, what's the next big adventure? Not expecting there to be any next big adventure. This would be the crowning glory of his career. And by the way, this is Lisa and also Terry and Bindi Irwin, the very suspicious Terry Irwin. Fedor has now become a wildlife ambassador, international wildlife ambassador for Australia Zoo. But yeah, I was talking to Fedor through Oscar about his next big adventure. And when he'd stepped off that boat in Mooloolaba that day, he had never actually been in a hot air balloon in his life. When he'd come back to the coast to unveil the plaque, he'd actually got his pilot's license to fly a hot air balloon. And he was going to make the world record attempt to fly around the world in a hot air balloon. He was going to try and break the American Steve Fossett's world record. So on the 12th of July, 2016, he set off from near Albany in Western Australia, and he went across the world and ended up breaking Steve Fossett's world record by 4 days, more than 4 days. He did it in 11 days and 8 hours. But then even just a couple of weeks after that, he had another balloon flight where he took a hot air balloon 21 kilometres above the Earth into the stratosphere. It was the first time that a manned balloon, hot air balloon, had ever been into space, what is effectively space. So just another amazing thing. And then a few days after that, he took another balloon up into the stratosphere again, once again 21 kilometres, this time with a co-pilot, and they stayed in space for 55 hours, which is the world record for someone being in space in a non-propulsion space vehicle. So he's an astronaut as well. Now, as soon as he finished that adventure, I noticed on Facebook that he was learning how to fly a glider. And I thought, oh, what now? Is he going to try and break the altitude record in a glider, or what's happening? And so I sent a text off to Oscar and said, what's happening with the glider? And he said, it's a secret, we can't say anything about it yet. But on the Saturday before we left Sydney a couple of weeks ago, I contacted Oscar again and said that we were going on this cruise and I was going to be speaking about his father. Is there any update on what's happening with the glider? And he said, we haven't announced it yet, we'll be announcing it this week, so you're the first to know about this. But he said that in 2020, so 2 years from now, they intend that Oscar will fly a plane around the world powered solely by solar power. And it'll be the first time someone has done that solo. So that's something to look forward to. But in the meantime, there's more. In October this year, he is going to take another hot air balloon 25 kilometres into the stratosphere and try and set a new world record on that. And if that's not enough, he has decided that about 10 weeks ago, Oscar sent a text and said, are you and Lee still in the UK? And I wrote back and said, no, we're in Cyprus. What's up? And Oscar wrote back and said that he and Fedor were going to be heading to England to inspect progress on the new boat. And it would have been great to catch up. And I wrote back and said, what new boat? And turns out that they were having another boat built in England. This is it. It's just been launched 2 weeks ago. And Fedor is going to try and set another world record. He's going to start off in Port Chalmers, which is near Dunedin in New Zealand, and he intends to row around the world. So from New Zealand across the Pacific to underneath South America, then across the South Atlantic and then go underneath Cape Horn in South Africa, and then across the Great Southern Ocean, go underneath Australia, and then back to New Zealand. That's all going to happen in November this year. So if you're on a cruise later this year or sometime next year, and you see some funny bearded guy with a purple hat rowing a big 9-metre orange boat, you can just turn to your fellow passengers and say, yeah, that's just Fedor Konyukhov, I know all about him. But after every adventure, he writes a book, and he sent me a copy of the book that he'd written about his trip across the Pacific, and with a nice sentiment. Once again, the video's not working, but he autographed the book for me, and apparently I'm mentioned in the book a couple of times, but it's not much good to me because it's all in Russian. He doesn't bother getting the books published in English, so everything's in Russian. So if anyone knows a English language publishing company that would like some great true life adventure stories, let me know. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm really proud to have these guys and call them as my friends. You may or may not agree with me that he is the world's greatest living adventurer, but I think you'd have to agree that he's a pretty remarkable guy. So that's the end of the presentation. I hope you enjoyed it. I hope you've learnt something about it. I'll be in here tomorrow at 9 o'clock and be speaking, which apparently is, because we're crossing the international date line, is today at 9 o'clock. Freaks me out. And I'll be speaking to you about the great French explorer La Perouse, who is only second to Cook as one of the great Pacific explorers. So I hope to see you all here for that. If anyone's got any questions, I'll be down here and to answer any questions. So thank you very much for being here, and see you tomorrow.